and a warm welcome on probably the coldest night of the year. So thank you to everyone for making the effort. In terms of the topic of tonight's talk, this was arranged last year sometime. The team here got in touch and said, would I do a talk? And I agreed to do it. And at the beginning of this year, they got back in touch and said, what should the topic be? What will the title be? And I came up with this just to show what an absolute fool I am, because I wasn't clear at all why I did that and how I was going to do it. So we'll see how we get on with it. The idea, I suppose, was to try and talk about the change in Edinburgh from around the time of St Cecilia's Hall opening. That was the sort of starting point that we were looking at, which is 1763. I was actually at an event here just a few weeks ago, last month, for Robert Ferguson on the 250th anniversary of his death. There was a night here, excellent night with Andrew O'Hagan, James Robertson, two of my favourite novelists as well, and Billy Kay, academics, music. It was a really nice night. It was much easier sitting there than it is standing here. I should say that as well. And that was good because it was all about that time as well, as I say, when St Cecilia's Hall opened, is when Ferguson was alive, even in his short life. But it also reminded me, when I was thinking about it, of the changes that have happened, because O'Hagan made a really good point, as he often does, and called Robert Ferguson Edinburgh's native-born genius. And I think that was a really sort of nice way of capturing him, but it's also quite important, and I'll say a bit more about that as we go on, about some of the writers who write from Edinburgh or about Edinburgh. Also the changes just in the sort of the old town itself, because there's a lot of it that is the same. There's a lot of it that's changed in terms of the people who are here and living here, in terms of social class or whatever, but there's a lot of buildings that are still here, this one obviously being one of them. But Ferguson's close is gone. That was a cap and feather close, which for people who don't know it, it was if you were to go up Niddry Street and go straight over where Byron's Burger is, and at the back of the hotel there was a close there which has been completely swept away in the name of progress, I suppose. So that's completely gone now, but it shows you just how close Ferguson is to where we were sitting, and he would have been completely aware of this place getting built and opening as well, so that's important as well. The other thing to say before I dive into as I sort of procrastinate here, is that I'm going to mention a lot of writers and artists, and some people will be surprised at the people I mention, and it's partly because we live in a sort of culture, a time where people say you shouldn't read this person, or you shouldn't listen to this person, or you shouldn't use that different social media platform, or whatever it is, and people like to have their own experience reflected back at them. They want to read novelists who agree with them, or who come from the same sort of background as them. I just reject that completely. Like, I read a novelist because I want to read a novel and see what it says. I didn't really, I'm not motivated by what his personal life is or what his politics is, and I didn't need my politics or my social worldview reflected back at me. So there's a lot of people who I'll mention here who have something interesting to say about this area, about Edinburgh, about change, and some of them we wouldn't necessarily agree with. But I think that's okay. Like, it's okay if you read something or you listen to somebody and they challenge your worldview, or even make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. So some of the stuff I might say might challenge your worldview, and it might make you feel a wee bit uncomfortable, and that's okay. That's okay. So without further ado, Faust. So this here is a painting which I think is sort of representative of the sort of Faust, Mephistopheles, the dynamic there we can see. Also, I noticed that this is by a guy called Colback. It's 1900, this painting, but I also think it looks a bit like John Knox, which I didn't intend, but it does look a bit, or a bit like me before I shaved my beard maybe. But it gives you the sort of sense of what's happening here, where we can see Mephistopheles looking in the background there, clearly up to no good, and we can see Faust, who's got the scroll. And this is, I think, as I say, quite representative. Faust, people will be familiar with it, the idea of Faust, with a Faustian pact. It's been common in our culture for about 500 years. Normally Faust is somebody with long hair. He's normally somebody who's learned, or he could be an academic, a scientist. He's somebody who's an outsider, somebody who lives a bit of an isolated, secluded life, focused on books and learning. But it's somebody who's really no very happy, and in some of the tellings he's near suicide, etc. There's a lot of variations of it, but I thought this painting sort of captured it nicely. And since in the 500 years that we're talking about, not only is there paintings, not only we've got to talk about Gotha, we've got Marlowe's representation, but also in popular culture, people would be in cartoons, it would be in songs, operas, movies. People who maybe be familiar with the movie Layer Cake, which is based on an excellent book by a guy called J.J. Connolly. And in the book and in the movie, Daniel Craig plays the drug dealer in the movie, who's not got a name. So his character is a drug dealer and he gets kidnapped by a gangster turned property developer, which in Edinburgh, there's loads of gangsters turned property developers. So we understand the dynamic here right away. And when he gets captured, the gangster's called Eddie Temple. And when he's dropping him off, he's kidnapped him, he's threatened him, he's done all the usual, and then he's dropping him off and he tells him, he says, I've got opera tonight, The Damnation of Faust. A man sells his soul to the devil. It all ends in tears. These arrangements usually do. And these arrangements usually do. And also later on, at the next time the two characters meet, Daniel Craig meets Eddie Temple, played by Michael Gambon, and he's in his big personal library. So again, it's a sort of the sort of implicit bit about Faust as well. But he's in his big personal library looking at his books, and Daniel Craig's character says to him, so how's the performance of Faust? And Eddie Temple says, complex. No wonder it took him 60 years to write it. And that brings us to Gotha. Johann Wolfgang Gotha, who's, a sort of fascinating figure for people who be familiar, I'm sure, with Gotha in one way or another. Poet, novelist, scientist, statesman, critic. He was born in 1749, died in 1832. He was it's very difficult to imagine somebody like Gotha in our time in terms of his range, activities and genius, I suppose, isn't too great a word, I think. He translated works from over 20 different languages. He was on sort of acquaintances with Napoleon, with Hegel. He was somebody who people right across Europe travelled to go and have dinner with him, to meet him. People who couldn't get to meet him corresponded with him. He was a sort of astonishing individual. And when Eddie Temple, the gangster, is referring to the 60 years, he's talking about Gotha's Faust, because he did indeed spend 60 years writing his version of Faust in two separate parts, and that's quite important. Tonight, when I'm going to talk about the change in Edinburgh and how we can think of that through Faust, I'm really talking about the later Gotha and the Faust Part 2, which I think is notably different from Faust Part 1, and noticeably different from earlier representations and different representations, and maybe even how we think about Faust ourselves, because a lot of the times it's been about individuals. So the individuals, I say, lives a secluded life, and he makes a pact with the devil to get something. And it might be that he has, unlimited knowledge, unlimited power, wealth for a certain period of time, and then the devil comes and takes his soul. But in part 2 of Faust, Gotha changes it and introduces other dynamics which are about social progress as well. So the gain isn't just to be about Faust himself, it's to be wider than that, and we can talk a bit more about that. But I think that's because we need to be conscious of when Gotha lived. As I said, he lived from the middle of the 18th century to 1832. The changes that went on in his lifetime are phenomenal, as we can imagine. It was an age of revolutions, but not just in terms of national, but also social, industrial revolution as well. So he had seen incredible changes through his life, and they think he was working on Faust Part 2 right up until he was on his deathbed. So he was trying to put into that everything that he'd learned and experienced and he'd seen through his whole long life. It's one of the books, I think, that if you were on a desert island or you got a 10-year sentence and you could only take one book, you would take Gotha's Faust Part 2. And after 10 years, you could still be learning something from it. It really requires a sort of ongoing engagement. As you can imagine, somebody spent 60 years working on it. The other thing to say is that Gotha had a relationship with Walter Scott. There we go, Walter Scott. And not only did Scott translate Gotha, Gotha translated Scott. And the first time Walter Scott put his name in a book was in a translation of a poem of Gotha. And obviously there was a whole load of publications that Scott did anonymously, but the first time his name appears in a book is in a translation of Gotha, which I think is important. And of course, there's the Scott Monument, but we are very close to where Walter Scott was born, at College Wynd, just along, further along in the Cowgate. And of course, he was educated at the high school, which used to dominate the Cowgate on the north side there, and we have high school yards still there, of course, but the school long gone. But the College Wynd has completely changed as well, but there is still a College Wynd. Edinburgh's got some of the places that are the same, and we've got some of the places where the names are the same. But Walter Scott was influenced by the German ballads and folklore, and we need to remember that he, before he became a famous novelist, he produced the Border Ballads, and he was a poet. And it was only later that he became famous for his novels as well. So he had a long relationship with Gotha, both of them translating each other's works. And we should also say that Gotha returns to German ballads that influenced Scott when he's working on Faust, including Faust Part 2. It's a big, the idea of German folklore was really important to him. As I said, some of the people didn't like Walter Scott now. It's like one of these things that's sort of almost become trendy to say nobody should read Walter Scott or something, because he's like a conservative, monarchist, unionist, very establishment figure, and so he doesn't get much good press, I don't think. But I actually think people should read Walter Scott. And if you were wanting to start somewhere, Old Mortality is a really good novel, I think, because it's about the Covenanting times and the Covenanters, which there's a lot of history here. We've got the execution spot in the Grass Market, and of course we have the Kirkyard where the Covenanters prison was as well. So there's a lot of that Covenanting history around here, which is really important, and I think Scott's novel's quite a good way into it, to be honest. And also Karl Marx, who knew a thing or two about books, he described Old Mortality as a masterpiece. He was quite a big fan of Walter Scott, so he gets a bit of a hard time. But the other thing to mention about Scott and Gotha is that when Eddie Temple, the gangster, refers to Damnation of Faust, that's an opera by Hector Berlioz, and he actually also did overtures for Walter Scott's novel Waverley and Rob Roy. So there's a whole lot of sort of interconnections that go on there between culture at that time. And I'd also just like to as we get back to Edinburgh specifically, we talk about, or I've spoke about Gotha's lifetime and the sort of changes that happen across the globe. You can think of the American Revolution, French Revolution, there's a rebellion in Ireland as well in 1798. There's a whole lot of, you can give weavers, a radicalisation of weavers, things happening across the place, including in Scotland, United Scotsmen involved with United Irishmen as well, of course. And Walter Scott's here during that time, and he's watching all of this change, and the change including in Edinburgh, because during this period is when they're building the new town as well. So there's a whole lot of changes happening here in the Old Town, where Walter Scott is born, where he's educated, and across the city he sees a whole lot of sort of dynamic changes that are happening. And one of the important ones that comes specifically from the new town and expansion of the city is the Union Canal. And that's opened in 1822, and the 1822 Union Canal is opened, and obviously during Scott's lifetime. This here is Robert Knox, the anatomist Robert Knox. Now, he didn't work on the Union Canal, but Burke and Hare, who he's forever linked with, they did work on the Union Canal. So the Union Canal, the expansion of the city, that all led to a whole lot of different people coming in here. Highlanders, Irish immigrants, a lot of navvies that came from England as well, who would have came to this area and settled here in the Old Town. And obviously then a lot of the wealthier people decide to build a new town and to get out. So they create a new town, and they also create one of the world's first slums as well when they abandon the Old Town. So this is Robert Knox, and Robert Knox is one of these interesting figures because, I don't know if people are familiar, but Robert Knox is obviously the person who Burke and Hare were killing people, and they were selling the bodies to Robert Knox. Now, Robert Knox at the time wasn't just some sort of marginal figure. Robert Knox was a hugely influential, important, powerful individual at Edinburgh University. During this period, when they opened the Surgeons' Hall Museum, they got Robert Knox to be the curator because he was such a sort of powerful and person who could attract a whole lot of people. Wealthy people across Europe sent their kids to come and see the anatomy classes, which happened just up at the back of where the anatomy place is still there, just at the back of where the high school had been. And people would come through, they would queue around the block to see his anatomy classes. He was you got a sense of that. The reason I put that picture up, you got a sort of sense of that there. He apparently wore flamboyant clothes, jewellery. It was a whole performance. He was very unlike the other anatomists. They could never figure out, the other anatomists competing with him, how he had such fresh bodies. But they later realised exactly how that had came to be. So Robert Knox was involved in this when the whole thing, and interestingly, when the whole thing comes out, the arrest warrants for Burke and Hare are issued on November the 19th, so it would be, yesterday would have been the anniversary, in 1828. And there's a connection here with Walter Scott as well, because Walter Scott followed the case really closely. Apart from knowing a lot of the key characters involved in it, it was the area that he was born into and he grew up into, so he understood all that. But he was also involved in the legal profession, so he used that access to get a lot of the notes. So he followed it quite closely, and we know that for his correspondence about it. And also he turned up at one of the executions and watched it through a window overlooking it, the execution. So he turned up to look at that. So it was a case that he followed really closely, and he would have known Robert Knox as well. I just want to just quickly, because it's great, there was a rhyme in Edinburgh at the time that the kids used to play, which which was up the close and down the stair, Button Ben with Burke and Hare, Buck's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the boy that buys the beef. So everybody knew what was going on. I mean, he was listed as one of the witnesses, was never called. There was protests at his house and what have you. The university eventually had to cut ties with him, but he was never charged with anything, and he just got to go on his merry way. Now, you might think that would be the last you would hear of Robert Knox, but unfortunately not. He moved to London, and then he became one of the leading theorists of race. In 1850, he produced a book called The Races of Men, because he believed, to quote him, that race is everything in human history. Now, there's a lot that I could say about Robert Knox that we don't have time for, but I said earlier, by the way, you should read people's books who you disagree with. I wouldn't recommend reading The Races of Men, like it's not a pleasant read at all. But he had a special hatred for Celts, for the Irish in particular, but Highlanders as well. So in a time where there was a sort of accepted sense that there was a racial hierarchy, and that was, we'd like to think about that now, but in Victorian times, around about here, intellectuals would have agreed there was a racial hierarchy. Knox took it a little bit further, but for him, the bottom of the peg were Celts. And he didn't view himself, he didn't think people from Lowland Scotland were Celts, obviously, he meant Highlanders, and in particular Irish. So he had a whole other career. He's been considered by academics to be the father of modern racism. Now, I say that because I do think it is important that people probably aren't aware of that. When we talk about racism in Scotland, we tend to think it has been something else, like it's a disease that somebody else sort of brings to us. So it's Nigel Farage's fault, or Donald Trump's fault, or it's somebody else's fault. But we maybe need to look a little bit closer to home, I think, to understand the sort of origins of some of the theory underpinning some of this stuff. And I like this picture. This is a picture from, I've seen it dated 1868 or 1870, but either way, it's pretty cool picture of the Cowgate, I think. And I just want to, before I talk a little bit about the Cowgate in particular, I want to introduce one other person here, which is Thomas Carlyle, who obviously has a lot of complicated and unpleasant things to say about race as well. But unlike Robert Knox, I think you should read Thomas Carlyle. I think he's got a lot of interesting things to say. But I want to mention him in connection with Goethe and Faust. Gotha and Thomas Carlyle were friendly. Carlyle was a lot younger than him, of course, but he translated Gotha. He'd been to visit him several times. And I just want to quote this letter. This was written on the 25th of June, 1829, and this is Gotha writing to Thomas Carlyle here in Edinburgh. He says, "While you were living in Edinburgh, I did not venture to come and find you, for how could I have hoped to find a quiet friend in that city of houses piled one above the other, so often pictured, and yet still something of a mystery to me." So it gives you the sense in which Gotha, for all his sort of his other interests, he really was quite fascinated by Scotland, by Scott, by Carlyle, by Burns, and he had a real vivid picture in his mind of what Scotland and Edinburgh looked like, which, and he's maybe not too far away from it as well when he describes it. By pure coincidence of history, these things happen, that just a few weeks, like 2 weeks after that letter was written for Gotha to Carlyle, Felix Mendelssohn, the famous composer, was here in Edinburgh. We know because his correspondence back home that he was walking about these streets as well, and his Scottish Symphony was inspired by his visit to Edinburgh and to Holyrood Palace. He talks about the Meadows, he talks about Arthur's Seat, and then he also went travelling up to the Highlands as well. So that was all, this is all happening in the same few weeks. The other thing I would just like to mention here to introduce, maybe to unsettle people, maybe not a bad thing to unsettle people, I suppose, is to mention the Russians. Are we allowed to mention the Russians? I'm not going to mention Vladimir Putin, but I think we need to think about Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground, Turgenev. All of these things are happening around the period we're talking about here. So these are just slightly after. You're talking about the 1860s, and it's very interesting to think about that in terms of Edinburgh, the Cowgate, the subterranean existence of what is the developing working class in the city, mostly immigrants as well. And we get a sense of it by our traveller. There's a traveller who's visiting Edinburgh, and he writes about the Cowgate and about Edinburgh. 1865 he writes this: "The Cowgate is the Irish portion of the city. Edinburgh leaps over it with bridges. The inhabitants are morally and geographically the lower orders. They keep to their own quarters and seldom come up to see the light of day. Many an Edinburgh man has never set foot in the street. The condition of the inhabitants is as little known to respectable Edinburgh as the habits of moles, earthworms, and the mining population." Now, the reason I quote that is because it gives us a pretty good sense of the conditions, and a visitor looking at and realising that not only people live in these conditions, but there's a whole swathes of Edinburgh that don't know anything about it, never come in contact with them. It's completely separate cities, completely to them. But also because if we think of Dostoevsky and his underground man, he refers to himself as being a mouse who lives underground with the rodents and with the lice. And that is exactly the same language, and Dostoevsky's book came out a year before that letter. So they're talking about people in exactly the same terms, but obviously coming at it from different perspectives. The other thing, just to quickly, I don't want to take me too many statistics, but in 1868, Edinburgh Corporation did a report, so we know exactly the conditions that people lived in here, and it's called a report on the conditions of poorer classes in Edinburgh. And they described the houses of working class people as dens, for a start. 72% of them in this area were single rooms. Across the whole of the area of the Old Town, so that's also like, we have to think of, we're talking about Canongate, we're talking about Grassmarket, we're talking about Westport. So in the whole of that area, the sort of slum area that we're investigating, 74% are employed, but in the Cowgate it's only 15%. 62% in the Cowgate are idle, so no education or employment they're talking about. The next highest figure is 30, so it's more than double. So all these statistics are more than double. They're worse by more than double in the Cowgate, which is the Irish quarter, compared to even our slums. Now, the Canongate was called the Scottish slum, not because it was full of Scottish people, because there was some Scottish people there. So there's a lot of Irish in other parts of it as well, but the Cowgate is particularly bad, and this is the period where this image is taken. It's exactly at this time. Now, I also want to say that this created a whole lot of interesting responses for people, as you can imagine. And Dostoevsky's hinting at that as well, in terms of nihilism and his critique of nihilism, and Chernysheva's What Is to Be Done, and, as I say, Turgenev as well. So he's identifying that there's got to be some sort of problem with this, and it's what form is that going to take. Now, here in this area at that time, you're talking about exiled communards for the Paris Commune. You're talking about socialists, anarchists, Fenians are exiled here. So there's a whole milieu, socially and politically, which is ready to go. People are all saying, we're not accepting this, we need to organise ourselves, we need to do something about it. And it throws up certain sort of fascinating relationships and characters. This here is a fantastic painting. Hopefully everybody here would know this painting, but this is a Mass in our Connemara cabin, and it's by a painter called Aloysius Kelly. And Aloysius O'Kelly he wrote this, he painted this in 1883, but the reason it's so interesting for this community is because this was discovered. This had been lost for over 100 years. It was his masterpiece. They knew there was sketches here, but nobody knew where it was, and it was discovered in the priest's house at the back of St Patrick's Chapel in the Cowgate in 2002. So it's quite a fascinating story. This is... if you get a chance, if you know already, you should get a chance to go to the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin and see it in all its glory, because it's massive. It's a huge painting, and a reproduction like that doesn't really do it justice. But I just want to mention this because it's interesting because of the connection here, but also we should think about O'Kelly for a little bit, who obviously we now know knew this part of Edinburgh and the people here well. O'Kelly was born into a nationalist family. Could say nationalist, some of them nationalists, some of them probably a bit more than nationalists in terms of Republican, maybe even revolutionary. And 3 brothers that were all involved in politics as well. 2 of them ended up exiled to New York after they were involved in politics in Ireland. O'Kelly himself at one point had to flee and go to Paris, and he used his brother's passport to get there, so we knew there's some sort of issue about why he didn't travel under his own name. He went to Paris, and the first thing he'd done in Paris was get in touch with James Stephens, who was the founder of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and whose sister had married into James Stephens' family. So he comes from a family that's steeped in Irish nationalist politics, and then the sort of struggle at that point over, like, thinking of the land war and things like that. So he's in Paris, and he eventually goes back to Ireland, and he does a whole illustrations. And this painting, as I say, was his missing masterpiece. Now, I've wrote previously, so I don't want to go on about this too much, but how this is a really interesting painting politically, or it's possible to read it that way, because you can see that the Mass is in the cabin. It's in Connemara, so it's a bit of island where there's a lot of strife, there's a lot of problem, a lot of repression. But you also get the sense that the Mass is the pregnant moment of the encounter. It isn't the crucial moment. And what that is probably, or possibly, I should say possibly, is nodding to is that what's coming next. And what's coming next might be a political meeting, which were banned at the time, or it might be some sort of more direct action that's coming next, and the priest's there to deliver the Mass before that occurs. And I say that because if you look at all Aloysius O'Kelly's illustrations, that's what he tends to do. He has a whole stream of things which happen, and if you look at one moment, the illustrations, you have to look at them in a sequence to really get it. Now, I want to say one other thing about paintings before we move on. This is Vincent van Gogh, and this is the Potato Eaters. I can't see it for the user, so I hope it's a sort of clear enough image. But if I can just quickly go back a way, and I go, right. So Aloysius O'Kelly's is 1883, and Vincent van Gogh does this in 1885. Now we know that Vincent van Gogh and O'Kelly are friends, and friends is maybe stretch it. They know each other really well in Paris. And we also know that Vincent van Gogh purchased a lot of O'Kelly's work, including the whole sequences of illustrations. And he was really taken by this idea of a gathering, and we can see the cabin could be the same cabin. Right? And this is called the Potato Eaters. So again, there's that nod to Ireland as well. And Vincent van Gogh apparently says that he took this potato through Thomas Carlyle's writing in the Charters in 1839, which I think is problematic. But you have to remember, this is a Dutch person in Paris, looking at what's happening in Ireland, and then try to transport that back to Holland. So we shouldn't be too critical. But there's a lot happening here. But what you can see is this is when Van Gogh's period, looking at put dignity into merely the potato, but also about the idea of the dignity of labour. And I think he sort of captured that. The other thing is just the setting. Everything about it really is very, very similar to Mass in a Connemara Cabin. So Aloysius O'Kelly was a huge figure, and that painting is fantastic, and it was in St. Pat's. And I would also just say that we don't know the exact reason, because you need to think, why was his missing masterpiece in the priest's house in St. Pat's? Now, we don't know the answer to that, obviously, but what we do know is it was there. And we do know that whatever he had given it to the parish or to the priest or to somebody connected with the church here at St. Pat's, they had decided to keep it quiet. They didn't say that's where it was. And everybody was looking for that painting at the time, because it was the only Irish painting to be exhibited at Paris Salon in 1884. It was then successfully exhibited in London, and then it disappears. But Aloysius O'Kelly never, he doesn't ever say, I wonder what's happened to my painting, or somebody stole my painting, or whatever. So, and he eventually emigrates to New York. But what we do know is it ends up here in St. Pat's. And I think there's something about that which is really significant and important, because this community, as I said, for all the problems that was there was people trying to do something about it. And the idea perhaps is that the gift of the painting was, and as a sort of thank you for some sort of assistance that people in this parish had gave to Irish nationalist or revolutionary politics, as well as James Connolly being from here. We also have Hibernian, the football team. So while Irish Catholics in Edinburgh couldn't join other teams because they were Irish Catholics, they formed their own team, which they didn't have to do, but they formed their own team. It's a really positive story. They formed their own team to say, we're here to stay, we want to play your games with you, but we are Irish Catholics. So they name the team Hibernian, and the harp is the crest with Erin go Bra, which is Ireland forever. So there's a sense of sort of defiance in that as well, about people standing their ground, and about self-organisation, about not relying on anybody doing anything for you. There was also an amateur team here until the 1930s called the Edinburgh Emmets, named after Robert Emmet. So this was a community steeped in that type of politics that O'Kelly would have agreed with, and we just have to assume that there was some reason why he gifted it to this community. The other thing is that it says on the painting in Dublin, it says it's on loan from the people of St. Patrick's Parish, which I think is a really sort of nice touch. Right, I'm going to change tack completely. Right, here we go. This is the Meadows. Nice picture of the Meadows. Everybody is familiar with the Meadows. There it is in relation to two books I want to talk about that are about Edinburgh between the wars, which are interesting to us. Let me just check the time. Yes. And the first one is David Dakey's book, Two Worlds, which people might be familiar with, published in 1957. It's a memoir of his time. Dakey's dad was the Chief Rabbi in Edinburgh for the period he's talking about, in the 20s and 30s, and for a longer period as well. The book's, it's a really, really good book, I should say that. It's a really good book. And he talks about his growing up here as not just a Jew, but as like a part of the most prominent Jewish family in Edinburgh, and the role that his dad had as the chief rabbi. And I think it's interesting just to think about what's in the book, and then also we can compare it with another book at the same time and ask what's known in it as well, not in any sort of critical way, but just the different perspectives that people have on it. And the reason we need to think about the Jewish community in relation to this area is because the first synagogue in Edinburgh was opened in this community in 1817. And it's also important to say that the records show that there were only 5 families in part of that synagogue who lived in the new town, which is to say the rest of them lived here. So they were poor, they were mostly immigrants, a lot of them from Russia, others from Lithuania, Poland, etc., who came here with nothing and then had their first synagogue here. And David Dacus talks a little bit about the synagogue. There was 2 synagogues when he's talking about the period in the 20s. One of them was up the south side, which he describes as being in a slum, so they closed it. And the other one was just off the Westport, and it was Graham Street. It's now called Keir Street, I think. But it was Graham Street at the time, and he describes that as being in a rundown part of town. Now, the interesting thing about that is because David Dacus is talking about his upbringing in Marchmont, so he mentions the Meadows a lot, and Meadows feature a lot. He also went to a private school just at the other side of the Meadows, so he talks about private school and going to the Meadows and mixing with other kids and everything being cool. And he also talks about his dad campaigning to get the new synagogue, which is the one that's up now at Salisbury, just up beside the Commonwealth Pool, which is there. It was opened, I think, 1934, I want to say, 1930s anyway. So it's a really interesting book, but I think there's other things in it that are alluded to, but aren't maybe teased out. And that's fair enough, because it's his memoir, it's not my book, so it's fair enough. But he talks about the good relationship that they have with local people, with local kids at his school and what have you. But there's no mention in the book at all about the Irish community or about Catholics. So when he talks about the relationship with Jews and Christians, it's always about Protestants or Presbyterians. So he refers to it in those terms, never Catholics, never Irish. And apart from the fact that they had to move the synagogue out of this area because it was a slum and because it was run down, what have you, there's no mention of the people here at all. And I just find that interesting, given the history of the Jewish community, connections with this immigrant community. That's quite interesting, I think. And it's not like we're talking about a period where this wasn't a factor. You know, in 1923, so the period he's writing about, is when the Church of Scotland have a report on the menace of the Irish race in Scotland, etc. So there's a lot happening there. The Irish community is under a lot of attack during that period, but you didn't get the sense of that in the book at all. The other thing that's interesting is there's a lot of talk, because the book goes up to the Second World War, so there's a lot of talk about fascism, but there's not any talk about the Spanish Civil War, which again just strikes you as being an omission, especially when we compare it to the book I'm going to mention next. So there's a lot of things that are in the book that are really interesting, but there's a lot of omissions that are there as well. And just one other sort of complexity that isn't mentioned in the book that David Dacus confirms many years later, which is that his father, the Chief Rabbi, was friends with John Cormac, who was the leader of Protestant Action in the city, and who had his militia, which was called Cormac's Caledonian Clan. I don't need to tell you what that was based on. And they would be attacking people leaving Mass, and particularly any sort of signy Irish Catholic was particularly like a red rag to a bull to them. And David Dacus' father, the Chief Rabbi, was a Freemason and was friends with John Cormac, to the point where John Cormac, when they tried to move into politics, and they did successfully move into politics, to the point they had several councillors in Edinburgh later on, but when they decided to make that shift, John Cormac goes to the Chief Rabbi and asks him to endorse him because they have such a good relationship. And now, I would say the Chief Rabbi had the good sense not to bother endorsing him, so we should be clear about that. But I do think there's lots of things that are not in the memoir about this community at that time which are interesting, and they're teased out in the next book, which is The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark. Now, Muriel Spark was Muriel Camberg. Her father was Jewish, so she's for the same community as David Dacus, so we're talking about people very similar. We're talking about the same period. The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is exactly the same period as David Dacus' memoir. David Dacus lives in Marchmont. Muriel Spark and the people involved in the novel, they live in Bruntsfield. So I mean, we're talking in the same part of town. The Meadows features heavily as well. So I just want to say a little bit about the book, which if anybody ever asks me what's the best book on Edinburgh, I always say The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, because it's fantastic. not just in terms of a sort of novel, but in terms of really getting to Edinburgh. And I think the reason for that is because Muriel Spark's from Edinburgh. She was living in New York when she wrote it in the 60s. She came back and lived here to write it, to get a feel for the language and the snobbery, the attitude of people in Edinburgh, and she really gets it, I think. And in this book, it's interesting because the key sequence is when the girls go a walk from their school, which is the old James Gillespie's at the other side of the Meadows for that picture, and they're walking, and she decides to take them into a walk into the Old Town. And this is where it's teased out. This is also where they have one of the girls has the revelation that Miss Jean Brodie, who really likes the fascisti, who goes to Italy on holiday and really likes the fascisti because they get the trains running on time, etc. And the girl, one of them has a real revelation when they pass the girl guides, and she sort of looks to her nose at the girl guides, and the girl thinks maybe we're like her fascisti. So maybe it's the first time where they think maybe she's not quite the positive influence that we think. Maybe there's something else happening there. But it's interesting because when they come into the Old Town, they do talk about all of these things that are missing for David Dickey's memoir. So when the girls come to the Grass Market, they say it's like visiting another country. So again, they're talking about the smells and the sounds, but there's that sense as well in which you're coming to another country because you're coming to a little island. There's a sort of, at least a hint to the sort of ethnic makeup of the area as well. The poverty is mentioned. The attitude of sort of bourgeois Edinburgh towards people who are unemployed is all mentioned. And we also get a sense in which the book jumps forward, and in one of the sequences jumping forward, she speaks to a man, and the man says about Edinburgh at that time, and there's a bit of snobbery about the schools, as there always is in Edinburgh. And but they also say they wanted to go to Spain to fight on the anti-fascist side because they were influenced by W.H. Auden. And again, that's really interesting because that's completely missing for the memoir, that sense in which fascism was understood. There was lots of working class people from Edinburgh went and joined international brigades and went to fight against fascism in Spain. You didn't get any sense of that in David Dickey's book at all, although, as I say, fascism and Nazism feature quite prominently. The other thing you get the sense in Miss Jean Brodie, which again ties in with this, is that they like the fascisti, but they like Catholics. So they try and explain it. It's explained, and that's a sort of really peculiarly Edinburgh, maybe a Scottish thing, but Edinburgh certainly. So there's people in Edinburgh who supported the fascists, but they couldn't accept their Catholicism. The fascism bit was all right, but they couldn't take it with the. So, and it's really, I mean, it is funny, but it's actually really, really typically Edinburgh-like. It's really, you can understand then why you have people who are fascistic and who have got militias that are attacking Catholics and Irish people who are in Protestant action, but who think, no, we can make an alliance with the Jews because we just didn't like the Catholics. And that's all there, just below the surface in the Prime Miss Jean Brodie. The other thing to say about Prime Miss Jean Brodie is the name, which alludes to Deacon Brodie, which of course was then taken up by Jekyll and Hyde, by Robert Louis Stevenson. And I think that again brings us to Faust. It brings us to Goethe, who says, 2 souls, alas, exist in my breast. And it's that idea that Goethe has in Faust, the 2 souls, one being pulled towards heaven and one being dragged towards hell. And Robert Louis Stevenson brings that out as well. Just one final point on these 2 books is that David Dickey's, when the book was republished as a classic in 1987, he wrote an interesting foreword to it and an important clarification where he said that he'd been really shocked that although the book had been mega successful all over the world, that it was often the title 2 Worlds was translated or was interpreted as being between 2 worlds. And he said that wasn't what he meant at all, that he felt of 2 worlds, both the Scottish Presbyterian world and the Jewish culture and history that he was part of, which is a really important point for him to make, but also then leads us to ponder, it's the Irish Catholics that are not of 2 worlds. They were between 2 worlds, and they fell through the cracks. And that, I think, is worth us pondering while we see all the new immigrants coming to Edinburgh and coming to Scotland, that maybe we should consider our history there before we condemn others, I think. Right, okay, got to change tack again. This is music. I think we should do a bit of music. I was going to play a clip of some of this music, but I think it really works. With classical music, you have to, I think, hear the whole piece if you can. Just quickly, this is Peter Grimes, Benjamin Britten. Benjamin Britten's a fascinating character. This Peter Grimes, he spent most of the war, or about 2 years of the war, in Brooklyn in a flat with his partner, both his professional partner and personal partner, Peter Pears, but also W.H. Auden, Christopher Isherwood, many other sort of artists and entertainers. They were in Brooklyn. Benjamin Britten didn't really like it, I don't think. So he came up with this idea to make an opera of Peter Grimes, which is an old poem by George Crabbe. And he came up with that idea in New York. He come back, he had to get signed off because he's a conscientious objector, he was a pacifist through his whole life. And but what's interesting here is the words by Montague Slater. Now, Benjamin Britten knew Montague Slater for the 1930s. He worked with him and Auden doing documentaries, which you can still find on workers' experience. They were sort of, Benjamin Britten was like Auden, they were sort of communist sympathisers, you know, they were sort of, I mean, they weren't members of, well, he was a member of the Communist Party, I don't think, but he was sort of sympathetic to that idea. So in the 30s, they'd done a series of documentaries about workers, like on the postal trains and down the mines and what have you. And Auden was involved. The idea as well was to get Auden involved, who was like a really prominent and excellent poet, and also to get Benjamin Britten, who was a really famous composer, so to get the best people involved to tell the stories of workers. Like, I think it's really good, and the films are still really good. Montague Slater was involved in that. And while they were doing these documentaries, Montague Slater got a lot of publicity because he wrote a play about James Connolly. So they were all lefties. Montague Slater was in the Communist Party, he was working class writer. So Benjamin Britten knew all this. And while he's in New York saying, I'm going to do this opera, who am I going to get to do the words like? Montague Slater, who done the play on James Connolly. So I think that's interesting as well. There's a couple of other things I just want to say about Benjamin Britten. People probably wouldn't think I'd want to talk about Benjamin Britten, but I actually find him really fascinating. Benjamin Britten, as I said, was a pacifist. Come back, was signed off as a conscientious objector. But it sort of troubled him, I think, that he'd been away for part of the war and hadn't really played a part. It troubled him about the Spanish Civil War as well, that his pacifism stopped him, like Auden went to Spain, but he didn't go. But what he did do is right after the war, with Yehudi Menuhin, the two of them went and toured around the liberated concentration camps. And when I say right after, I mean they were liberated in April 1945. Him and Yehudi Menuhin, the two of them were there in June. So, and then they travelled around playing music, which is, you know, pretty astonishing. And I think if you read the reports of it as well, it's quite sort of traumatic. Some of the times they got to the camps and the people are obviously still really ill and being looked after, but they're playing music in the camps to people, but people with something like strength to applaud and things, you know. So it sounds like a really, I think both him and Yehudi Menuhin were really, it said he couldn't speak about it for the rest of his life, about what he'd seen and the experience of it, like, so I think it was really powerful. But just one other thing to say about that is that one of the pieces of music they played was by Felix Mendelssohn, who had been in Edinburgh, as I mentioned, because Felix Mendelssohn was Jewish, and so his music had been banned by the Nazis. So the first time it was played after the war was by Benjamin Britten and Yehudi Menuhin. And let me just say one other thing about that, is that Yehudi Menuhin in 1958 was playing at Usher Hall, and they decided to have a concert in Pilton, which everybody knows Pilton, one of the bigger housing schemes. And they went down and they packed the place out. When they arrived in the cars to play this classical concert at the Embassy Cinema in Pilton, there was queues of people in the streets, and they were saying, I wonder what are the people here, must be something happening. And they said, no, they're for you, like, they're for you. And the concerts that Yehudi Menuhin was playing in Usher Hall was who? Felix Mendelssohn. So I think it's probably not too much of a stretch to think that when he went to that working class housing scheme, he was playing Felix Mendelssohn, which has resonated with him through the concentration camps, particularly Belsen, I think, was one of the really powerful ones. But also there's a connection with Mendelssohn in Edinburgh, which I don't know if Yehudi Menuhin mentioned or not, but I'll mention it anyway. Right, here we go. What is the time situation like? Right. This is Coventry Cathedral. Now, I don't know, again, I can't really see that picture from here, but the bit that's nearest to me is the ruin of the cathedral, and obviously the other bit is the newer cathedral. And the reason I want to mention that is because Coventry had been bombed by the Nazis in November, actually, 1940, and the cathedral was completely destroyed. And after the war in 1950, they decided to have a competition to try and get to rebuild, to get a new cathedral. And an Edinburgh-based architect called Basil Spence, when he heard that, he jumped in his car and drove to Coventry, because he wanted to actually see for himself. Before he put in a proposal, he wanted to really see it and to get an impact on himself before he started working on it. And he said that as soon as he went there, he realised that the ruins were really important, that the ruins had to be part of the new cathedral. And he eventually won the prize, and this was opened in 1962. Now, to bring things sort of like a circle, the 1962 when it opened, there was a piece of music that was commissioned by the state for that, which was the War Requiem, and that was by Benjamin Britten. Now, again, I think it's sort of fascinating, because Benjamin Britten's somebody who people think of as being like this sort of friend of the Queen. I think he wrote 4 pieces at the personal request of the Queen, and for all these major state occasions like this, Benjamin Britten was a go-to person for the state. But to my mind, it's important to remember that Benjamin Britten was an outsider, considered himself an outsider. He was a gay man at a time when being a gay man was really dangerous for him. And as I say, his politics were different. He was a pacifist, but yet he's chosen to do the War Requiem. And he does the War Requiem. And we've got another Edinburgh connection, because what he decides to do is not just do a standard War Requiem, because he doesn't want to celebrate war. So he introduces the poems of Wilfred Owen, the anti-war poems of Wilfred Owen. He introduces them into the Requiem, which is sort of fascinating. And when you listen to it, it isn't necessarily clear immediately what's happening, and it's not even clear whether people understood completely, whether the state understood completely what he's doing. But in this War Requiem, which is seen after the Second War, the rebuilding of Coventry Cathedral was seen as being another great achievement by the state, and they had everybody there, all the royals, and they had this new piece of music by the top composer, and into it he interjects this anti-war poetry that Wilfred Owen had written in Edinburgh. And there's also one of the poems that he mentions that I should just say that he is about 2 soldiers who speak to each other, they come together, and it isn't clear until the end of it that they're actually in hell. Both of them are in hell. Now, the key lines telling you they're in hell are missed out of the War Requiem. Benjamin Britten probably just thought that was maybe a step too far. Right, I'm winding up. This is Basil Spence, council housing, right? This is the council housing on the Canongate that was built by Basil Spence, architect. He designed it by Basil Spence. Now, we know, and people will know, if they don't know already, Basil Spence done a lot of stuff in Edinburgh. He was based in Edinburgh for a long time. His offices were at Rotten Square, but he did the University Library, he did the Scottish Widows Building, Morton Hall Cemetery, and council housing, loads of other buildings as well. So, but this is interesting to me, because we need to be thinking, right, okay, what are we talking about, the change in Edinburgh? What's Faust got to do with this? Like? Well, this was at a time where the state took seriously its responsibility to house its citizens. We are now in a totally different situation altogether, where the idea that the state would build council housing and get the top architect, the most successful and sought after architect, and get them to come and do it is for the birds. Because we live in a period where Edinburgh has completely been transformed with the changes that have happened to our public space. And so I wanted to end with the people story, which people will be familiar. The council bureaucrats closed it before the councillors had decided to close it. They just closed it. The councillors then rubber stamped that decision, and they've now said they've got to reopen it, but there's still, I think, a whole lot of problems with it. No with the people story, with the council's building strategy, which is essentially about changing this city in a way that is not in the interests of citizens. And I've just outlined a whole lot of changes that have happened over the last 250 years. So change happens. Nobody's wanting things to stay the same. Change happens. But the change that's happened in the last 20 or 30 years in this part of Edinburgh is of a different order altogether, where one class of people has been replaced by another, with no democratic debate, with no public discourse around it. And in fact, we're in St Cecilia's Hall here, which the university have done a great job of restoring and maintaining, but just think within a stone's throw through here, St Anne's Community Centre, gone. Southbridge Resource Centre, gone. Dummer Community Centre, gone. And then the People's Story was to be next. So we need to, I think, ask ourselves, who is change for? And that does bring us to Faust, and to the idea in Faust Part 2, which is that for the advancement of the individual, there has to be some sense in which there's a social advancement as well. They have to go in tandem. And so, well, at the end of Faust, he is trying to be a developer. He is taming the sea. He is building these whole complexes with a lot of immigrant labour. Sometimes slave labour is referred to. So it's people who are suffering building it. But at every stage, when Mephistopheles is saying to him about, you can just make a few quid doing this or get rich quick, he's like, no, this has to be something I'm building, which is not just for me, which is for people in the future. And I think we've somehow lost that in Edinburgh, and we need to try and get back to it. And the last thing I want to say about Faust is that there's characters that Goethe introduces, which I think are really important to us just now. And that is Philemon and Baucis, the old couple who, they're the only bit of land, the only wee space that's left in this whole development that Faust creates. It doesn't interfere with them at all. They're lovely people. He can't settle until he gets rid of them. So he has to get Mephistopheles to go and kill them, because he has to wipe out any sense of an alternative. He has to have control of everything. And that is exactly what's going to happen in this city if we didn't actually try and put some sort of constraints on what's happening. Because developers, like Eddie Temple, like the developers and the council, allowed to continue to do what they're doing with a neoliberal building strategy, there'll be nothing left. We will be like the old couple. And the old couple, of course, Goethe knew he was taking them from Ovid for the Metamorphoses. These were the old couple who symbolised welcoming. These were the old couple who allowed the disguised gods in when all the other people in the village shunned them. And that, in many ways, is the experience of Edinburgh, that we have been welcoming different communities, including my own family for Highland. We have been. And we need to learn the lessons of our own past so as we can make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Thank you very much. One minute to go.
I'm very impressed. I always find it really hard to stay under the time limit that I'm given when I do things like this. So having 1 minute left is really impressive, especially considering how much you actually did manage to pack in, and that was really, really interesting. Thank you once again, Jim. Just one more round of applause, I think. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. As Hannah mentioned before, we'll be running a talk series once every sort of quarter. So do keep an eye out on our social media channels and on our website for the next talk. But we do also have other events running. We have sort of the Carr masterclass this week as well by our current artist in residence, who's with the Cervantes Institute. We've got a couple of concerts coming up for the Christmas season, things like that. Again, all on our social media and on our website. And we can't